A tragic situation has been unfolding. 9 teenagers.
Massive flash floods created by heavy rains hit the Israeli desert.
Long lines as an Orthodox clergyman stood at the front, a strong glow for...
A sudden and devastating catastrophe has just struck Jerusalem, unleashing destruction with a force no one expected. Yet what followed was even more unsettling. A rapid sequence of unexplained phenomena erupting across Israel. Ancient chambers cracking open beneath the Judean wilderness, mysterious lights appearing inside sacred sanctuaries, strange activity rising from the Mediterranean waters, and rivers and skies behaving in ways scientists cannot explain. As the world watches in disbelief, one question grows louder. What if these events are not random at all, but signals pointing toward a moment long foretold? Stay with us. What you are about to see may reshape the way you understand the time we've now stepped into. Before we begin, please like, comment, and subscribe to support this channel. No one in Jerusalem will forget the moment the sky changed. What began as an ordinary afternoon over the ancient city shifted with terrifying speed into an event that defied every forecast, every scientific model, and every human explanation. Witnesses say the air grew unnaturally still, an eerie silence that felt less like weather and more like a warning. Birds stopped mid-flight, dogs began whining, and even the breeze seemed to withdraw from the hills surrounding the holy city. Then, without a single rumble of thunder, the heavens opened. A barrage of hailstones, massive, jagged, and unnaturally bright, came hurtling down with a violence that felt almost deliberate. These were not the familiar rounded pellets of a winter storm. The stones were sharp, fragmented like pieces torn from some celestial furnace, crashing into rooftops, ancient stone streets, and terraces that had stood firm for centuries. In just seconds, the noise grew deafening, like thousands of hammer strikes hitting the city at once. The old city was struck hardest. Along the paths winding up toward the Temple Mount, centuries-old stones cracked under the force. At the Mount of Olives, the damage was even more harrowing. Olive trees that had weathered wars, droughts, and empires snapped like brittle branches beneath the icy assault. Several trees, believed to be among the oldest living witnesses of Jerusalem's history, split down the middle as if cut by an unseen blade. One groundskeeper, shaking as he spoke, said, "These trees have stood longer than nations, but in 7 minutes they were broken." Across Jerusalem, the freezing barrage hammered everything in its path. Roof tiles shattered, balconies collapsed, and windows burst outward as if from an internal shockwave. Vehicles parked along the narrow streets were dented and crushed in patterns that meteorologists later described as consistent with falling debris from extreme altitude. Yet, no aircraft, no explosion, no meteor had been recorded in the region. The hailstorm lasted 7 minutes. That short span was enough to scar the city in ways that emergency workers say would normally require an earthquake. But the physical destruction was only part of the mystery. During the hailstorm, Jerusalem's electrical grid flickered violently. GPS devices malfunctioned, phone signals dropped, and security cameras across multiple districts recorded inexplicable static bursts at the exact moment the largest hailstones struck the ground. Pilots flying above the region reported sudden magnetosphere interference, a phenomenon associated with solar storms, yet none had been detected. Veterinarians across the city received dozens of reports of animals panicking moments before the impact, as if reacting to something inaudible to human ears. When meteorologists reviewed the data, they found something even harder to explain. The atmospheric pattern that produced the storm did not match any known meteorological behavior in the Middle East. There had been no preceding temperature drop, no storm front, no humidity shift, nothing that should have supported hail formation, let alone hail of this size and intensity. One researcher stated bluntly, "This storm formed out of nothing. It appeared fully developed over Jerusalem, as if triggered by a switch." That sentence spread quickly among religious communities. In synagogues and churches alike, leaders began referencing the biblical accounts of sudden judgments, events where the skies themselves became instruments of divine communication. The parallels were hard to ignore. In Exodus, hail fell upon Egypt as a sign of God's displeasure. In Joshua, hailstones struck Israel's enemies with pinpoint precision. In Job, hail was described as being stored for times of trouble. Massive hail appears as a sign in the final shaking of the earth. In Jerusalem, many felt the weight of those verses as they walked through the destruction. It was not simply the severity of the storm, it was the unnatural precision, the suddenness, and the unmistakable sense that the event had meaning. 7 minutes reshaped the city. But what followed, strange discoveries, impossible phenomena, and signs echoing across the land, suggested that the storm was not the end, but the beginning. A signal, a warning, a threshold moment where the natural and supernatural touched the earth at the same time, and Jerusalem stood at the center of it. While meteorologists and physicists tried to categorize the Jerusalem event, another group reached conclusions far more quickly. Religious historians and prophetic scholars recognized a familiar structure, an ancient pattern described across centuries of sacred writings. They did not see an atmospheric anomaly. The first clue lay in the hailstones themselves. Forensic teams found they were nothing like typical layered ice. Each stone held a crystalline core with sharp spires radiating outward, almost like fragments of carved glass. Their density far exceeded normal hail, and many displayed geometric fractures that looked engineered rather than naturally formed. Several field responders also reported something unexpected. The hail carried a faint metallic scent mixed with an herbal fragrance, a smell no one could identify, and unlike anything produced by atmospheric chemistry. One engineer admitted, "These could not have formed under standard atmospheric conditions." The storm's behavior deepened the mystery. Satellite models revealed that the storm cell tightened as it approached Jerusalem, concentrating over the old city instead of dispersing across the surrounding terrain. The hills, valleys, and plains outside Jerusalem experienced minimal impact, while narrow corridors of ancient streets absorbed the storm's full power. Scientists labeled this inexplicable. Theologians called it recognizable. In Jewish and Christian writings, hail is rarely depicted as accidental weather. It appears during pivotal moments, when nations cross moral thresholds or when warnings go unheeded. Hail, in this symbolic framework, arrives with intention. Thus, many rabbis privately revisited older commentaries, one describing hail as the cold rebuke that descends when pride burns unchecked, another speaking of unusual storms arising when the earth groans beneath ignored warnings. Christian scholars noted that the New Testament links extraordinary hail to spiritual upheaval, moments when heavenly and earthly realms respond simultaneously. Revelation describes hail as a signal that something in the unseen world has shifted. Many who studied the Jerusalem event believed exactly that a shift had occurred. The most intriguing analysis came from experts in biblical geography. When they mapped the damage zones, they discovered that the storm's path connected locations tied to covenant promises and prophetic judgments in ancient times. The concentration of destruction along these routes suggested not randomness, but alignment with history, not with weather patterns. International reaction reflected this tension. Some dismissed the alignment as coincidence. Others felt the precision was too striking to ignore. A few analysts proposed that the storm responded to spiritual geography, an idea rejected by science but deeply rooted in ancient belief. Meanwhile, Jerusalem's residents reported sensations they felt moments before the storm. A heaviness in the air, the sense of something unseen drawing near, or a pressure that seemed to hover over rooftops. These impressions were subjective but widespread. The event had not merely broken stone. It had stirred awareness. Media coverage intensified global unease. Headlines framed the storm as unprecedented, unnatural, or even symbolic. And beneath all commentary lay a single growing question. If Jerusalem has entered a prophetic cycle, what now waits beyond the first sign? The storm was the beginning. Even as Jerusalem's emergency crews worked tirelessly to clear the streets and restore order, a second, quieter event unfolded far from the noise of the city, an event that would soon eclipse the hailstorm in mystery. It happened in the barren stretches of the Judean wilderness, a region where the earth hides secrets older than any kingdom still standing today. What emerged there was not destruction, but revelation. A minor tremor barely noticeable in Jerusalem ran beneath the desert and fractured a rock outcrop near an archaeological zone monitored by Israel's Antiquities Authority. Patrol teams sent to inspect the site discovered something astonishing. A large fissure had opened in the ground, wide enough for a beam of light to penetrate deep below. When one researcher lowered a camera into the gap, its descent revealed the unmistakable geometry of worked stone. It was a chamber sealed, forgotten, and untouched for what appeared to be centuries. Within hours, a specialized excavation team arrived, clearing debris until the chamber entrance was exposed. The air that escaped was cold, dry, and ancient, as though it had not circulated since the days when prophets still walked the land. Lights were lowered inside, revealing a rectangular room carved meticulously from limestone, its walls engraved with inscriptions obscured by age and mineral dust. But the centerpiece of the discovery dominated everything else. A stone sarcophagus standing in the middle of the chamber. Its lid bore a thin crack running diagonally across the top, as if someone or something had once tried to force it open. Around the sarcophagus lay skeletal remains, several of them positioned strangely. They were not scattered or collapsed. They were arranged. Each skeleton knelt, facing the sarcophagus. Each held a rusted sword, the blade pointed inward. The posture was unmistakable. They had died in the act of guarding whatever the sarcophagus contained. Archaeologists stood silently for minutes before speaking. The find was unlike any burial practice known in Judea. Warriors buried alive to guard a tomb appeared nowhere in Israelite tradition. One historian whispered, "This isn't a burial chamber, it's a containment chamber." But the strangest detail was not the skeletons, it was the light. Throughout the day, a column of sunlight fell directly onto the sarcophagus, even as shadows inside the chamber shifted. The beam passed through the fissure in the surface above, striking the stone at nearly the same angle regardless of the hour. Astronomers were called in to determine whether the shaft of light aligned with a particular solar position or seasonal event. But early estimates suggested something far stranger. The architecture of the chamber had been engineered to catch sunlight in a way modern calculations could not fully explain. This precision indicated intention purpose. Ancient Jewish and Christian scholars later compared this occurrence to prophetic symbolism found in Scripture. "Arise, shine, for your light has come." Isaiah 60:1. There is nothing hidden that will not be revealed. The souls beneath the altar cried out. Revelation 6-9. The parallels stirred immediate debate. What event, what prophecy, or what secret was important enough to warrant a sealed chamber guarded by warriors who died in kneeling positions? And why would such a structure open now, days after an impossible storm struck Jerusalem, rumors spread quickly. Some believed the sarcophagus held sacred writings protected during war. Others proposed the remains of an ancient prophet or martyr, whose identity had been preserved only in oral traditions. A few archaeologists whispered theories about pre-exilic priesthoods hiding relics during times of invasion. Yet one pattern underlined all hypotheses. Whatever lay inside the chamber, ancient people had considered it dangerous or divine. Government officials sealed off the site, forbidding unauthorized personnel from approaching. But leaks still emerged from insiders who claimed the inscriptions on the wall contained warnings. One fragment reportedly read, "For the appointed season, sealed until awakening." If true, the implications were staggering. It would suggest that the chamber was not simply preserving history, it was waiting for a specific moment in history. A moment marked by signs, upheavals, or cosmic alignment. A moment like now. Israeli authorities denied the leaked translation, but their refusal to release further details only fueled speculation. Religious leaders called urgent meetings. Academic circles whispered of a prophetically timed unveiling. Meanwhile, social media erupted with theories, diagrams, and attempts to decode blurry images smuggled from the excavation. But inside the scientific teams, one fact troubled them most. The crack in the sarcophagus lid was fresh, not ancient, not weathered, new. The tremor may have exposed the chamber, but something had already strained the stone from within. For a sarcophagus untouched for centuries, such damage made no sense. A geologist involved in the assessment wrote, "The fracture lines originate from internal pressure. It appears the lid cracked from the inside out." His statement was quickly removed from public access. Yet the question remains. Had something moved? Had the contents shifted? Was the chamber beginning to open on its own? No one is prepared to answer, but everyone is watching. Because in prophetic patterns throughout Scripture, physical manifestations, earthquakes, opened tombs, tearing veils precede moments of revelation. If the storm was the warning, the chamber feels like an invitation, or a countdown. Stay with us. What emerges next may redefine everything Jerusalem and the world thought it understood. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, not with a dramatic event but with a sound. A low, resonant vibration was detected by Israel's coastal monitoring stations, echoing at irregular intervals through the underwater canyons off the coast of Haifa. At first it was dismissed as maritime noise, perhaps the groaning of tectonic plates or the distant engine pulse of foreign submarines. But the frequency was wrong, and the rhythm was unnatural. Acoustic analysts studied the signature and concluded that the vibrations were organic, not mechanical, and far larger in scale than anything typically produced by known marine life. The signal had a strange, deliberate cadence, as if something in the depths was sending out pulses at measured intervals. Within days, fishermen along the Carmel coast began reporting unsettling encounters. Schools of fish dispersing violently, nets being torn from below, and a sudden absence of dolphins, which normally travel near the shoreline. One veteran captain described the sea as nervous, an observation he could not explain, but felt deeply. The Mediterranean had changed temperament. Then came the footage. A group of Israeli naval divers, conducting routine training exercises, captured something on their underwater cameras, something that initially appeared to be a figure gliding through the murky blue, partially obscured by drifting sediment. The divers froze, expecting to identify a large fish, or perhaps a seal. But what emerged from the haze forced them backward in shock. The creature was humanoid, but not human. Its torso bore unmistakable human contours, shoulders, arms, and a head with a structure eerily reminiscent of a human face. But the lower half tapered into a powerful, serpentine form covered in pale, scale-like ridges. Along its back ran a line of bony spines, each one faintly luminous in the diver's camera lights. The creature moved slowly, not with the instinctive darting of marine animals, but with a controlled, almost thoughtful glide. More disturbing was its behavior. It was watching them. The divers reported that the being displayed no fear, no hesitation, no attempt to flee. Instead, it held its position at a distance, like an observer studying an unexpected visitor. The ocean around it seemed unnaturally still, as though the creature's presence altered the environment itself. A few moments later, it turned not abruptly, but with a deliberate shift, and descended deeper into a rocky trench, disappearing between jagged formations as if slipping into a place it knew well. The footage was classified immediately. But as always, classified material has a way of escaping its vault. A short, grainy segment leaked into the public sphere, sparking international debate. At first, skeptics insisted it was manipulated, or a misinterpretation of an octopus or seal. But marine biologists countered, nothing known to science moved in that way, or possessed such anatomical features. The proportions were too precise, the skeletal silhouette too distinct. Even more troubling were the acoustic readings taken after the sighting. The deep frequency pulses increased in volume and complexity, almost as if responding to the diver's presence. The seafloor sensors recorded a low rumble that traveled along the continental shelf, triggering minor seafloor disturbances. It was as though something vast beneath the waters had awakened or shifted. Religious scholars approached the event differently. The imagery of a being rising from the sea is among the most symbolically charged in prophetic literature. Revelation describes a beast emerging from the waters during apocalyptic transition. Isaiah speaks of Leviathan, the twisting serpent of the deep, a creature subdued only by divine intervention. For centuries, these passages were interpreted symbolically, metaphorically, or mythologically. But now, with the Mediterranean sightings circulating through global media, those ancient lines felt unnervingly literal. Some commentators pointed out that the creature was not monstrous in the conventional sense. It was not attacking, thrashing, or behaving aggressively. Instead, it was observant, almost sentient in its movements. That raised a different set of questions. Was it fleeing something deeper below? Was it part of a species long hidden from the surface? Or was its appearance timed, coinciding with the upheavals unfolding across Israel? One theologian noted an obscure rabbinic commentary describing the sea as where the deep holds memories of creation and the signs of its end. Others referenced ancient seafaring legends of beings who appeared during eras of great moral or national crisis. Such texts were often dismissed as folklore, but modern events were forcing scholars to reconsider them. What unsettled investigators most was the creature's escape path. The trench into which it vanished was not random. Geological maps showed that the formation led to a labyrinthine network of underwater caves stretching far beneath the Mediterranean basin, spaces so deep and narrow that submersibles could not navigate them. These caverns had always been inaccessible, their contents unknown. If something had emerged from those depths, the question was not merely what it was. The question was why it had risen now, and why it had surfaced near the coastline of a nation experiencing unprecedented signs, on land, in the air, and beneath the earth. The sea had spoken in its own way, through vibrations, through silence, and finally through a physical manifestation that defied taxonomy and comprehension. It was as if the Mediterranean itself was signaling that the upheavals in Jerusalem were not confined to the land alone. The deep had stirred, and something was watching from below. Another phenomenon unfolded quietly inside a small sanctuary in Jerusalem, one that required no scientific instruments, no excavations, and no seismic activity. It happened in a place meant for silence, prayer, and ordinary worship. Yet for those present, nothing about that moment felt ordinary. If the storm had shaken the city from the outside, this event seemed to press inward, touching something at the core of every soul in the room. Until a presence appeared beside the pastor. There was no sound preceding it, no draft of wind or shimmer along the ceiling. Instead, a subtle warmth gathered near the pulpit, as though the air itself had begun to glow. The congregation watched in disbelief as the illumination intensified, not harsh or blinding, but soft and golden, radiating outward like the first light of dawn. And then they saw it. A figure stood beside the pastor, formed not of solid flesh, but of concentrated light, shaped into unmistakable human contours. Taller than any person in the room, its outline shifted between brilliance and translucence, as if it existed halfway between the world they knew and another just beyond perception. Gently curved wings, neither feathery nor abstract, but luminous, extended from its back in a motionless arc. Witnesses later said they felt the atmosphere change, not in temperature, but in gravity, as though the entire sanctuary were suddenly aware of being observed by something holy. Musicians halted mid-note. The pastor froze, his expression shifting from confusion to awe as the figure turned slightly toward him. Several congregants cried out softly. Children clutched their parents. An elderly woman whispered a prayer through trembling lips. Then the moment deepened. Each time the people lifted their voices in worship, the angelic form brightened, its glow pulsing gently in rhythm with the singing. When the congregation prayed for the peace of Jerusalem, the figure inclined its head, an unmistakable gesture of acknowledgement. Reports later described a warm radiance encircling the pastor, as if he had been wrapped in a mantle of light flowing from the being's presence. Those who witnessed it insisted there was nothing accidental or mechanical about what they saw. The figure's edges did not flicker like refracted light. Its motions, subtle, deliberate, proved it was not a projection or illusion. Its presence filled the room with a serenity that defied language. For nearly 20 minutes, the angel stood without speaking. The brightness around it shifted in gentle waves, casting elongated shadows across the stone floor. And then, with the same quietness that marked its arrival, the figure faded, first the wings, then the outline, then the glow, until only the ordinary sanctuary remained. The lamps stayed on the entire time. Nothing malfunctioned. No device in the room could have created what they saw. Afterward, engineers inspected the building, searching for reflective surfaces, hidden lights, or structural quirks. They found nothing unusual. Photographs taken from multiple angles all captured the same silhouette, the same luminous contours standing beside the pastor. Analysts online attempted explanations involving lens artifacts or atmospheric reflections, but none accounted for the coordinated responses to prayer or the uniformity across different devices. Scholars quickly connected the event to a long biblical motif: divine messengers appearing during seasons of upheaval. In Scripture, angels often arrive not as symbols, but as confirmations, evidence that what is unfolding on earth is intertwined with what is stirring in heaven. To many, the sequence was now unmistakable. The land had been shaken, the depths had stirred, the sea had responded, and now heaven had sent a messenger. Land, depths, sea, heavens, each realm had answered. The encounter inside the sanctuary did not bring destruction. It brought revelation, a sense that unseen boundaries were thinning, that the spiritual realm was drawing nearer, that Jerusalem was standing at the edge of something momentous. Whether one interprets it as warning, comfort, or calling, one truth remained undeniable to all who witnessed it. Something had crossed over, and something was preparing to speak. While Jerusalem struggled to interpret the meaning of events unfolding above the city and beneath its foundations, A quieter, yet equally baffling transformation began far to the east. It happened along the Jordan River, a place woven deeply into the spiritual memory of Israel. A river where prophets walked, kings crossed, and generations found their beginnings. Known for its muted greens and sediment-filled flow, the Jordan rarely attracts attention outside of pilgrimage. But one evening in late autumn, the river changed. A group of hikers near the northern stretch noticed the water had taken on a shade they had never seen before, a luminous green that seemed to pulse beneath the surface. At first, they assumed it was algae, but algae blooms move slowly and gather in patches. What they witnessed moved like something alive, thin ribbons of light drifting along the current, curving and weaving as though tracing invisible paths in the water. By nightfall, the phenomenon intensified. The river did not merely glow, it shimmered. Lines of brightness raced across the surface like electrical currents traveling through liquid. The glow was soft yet unmistakable, bright enough that the silhouettes of reeds and stones along the riverbank cast faint shadows. Birds that normally perched along the water's edge kept their distance, circling uneasily overhead. Videos posted online spread instantly, and soon crowds gathered along the banks, whispering in awe as the water illuminated their faces. Children reached out to touch the glow, only to recoil when the light flickered beneath their fingertips, as though withdrawing deeper into the current. Scientists arrived the next morning, expecting to identify pollutants or runoff from industrial zones upstream. Instead, they found no toxins, no compounds, no algae concentrations large enough to account for the spectacle. Chemical analysis showed mostly normal mineral content. The glow, which had dimmed slightly during daylight, returned each evening in shifting patterns, as if responding not to contaminants, but to time itself. Then came the strangest observation. The light moved against the current. During one recorded segment, a wave of brightness curled upstream for nearly 20 meters before folding back into the flow. Hydrologists described it as hydraulically impossible, yet the recordings were clear. Local communities began referring to the phenomenon as Or Hanahar, the light of the river. Religious scholars took immediate interest, noting how the river had played a role in moments of transition throughout biblical history. In Exodus, water changed under divine judgment. In Revelation, waters turning strange and fearful were markers of upheaval. Some pointed to a lesser-known prophetic passage describing rivers that bear witness before the mountains tremble. Though rarely cited, the verse resurfaced as the Jordan continued glowing night after night. Pilgrims traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem reported a sensation of heaviness near the water, not oppressive, but significant, as if the air carried a message. One described it as standing near a threshold. Another said, "I felt like the river knew something we did not." Authorities attempted to restrict access to prevent overcrowding, but the more they limited entry, the more people wanted to see it. News outlets from Europe and America began sending film crews. Environmental groups issued statements demanding chemical transparency, but the government insisted that no pollutants were detected. Privately, however, several researchers admitted confusion. The river's glow behaved less like a chemical reaction and more like an interaction, one tied to the flow of water, the fall of night, and perhaps even to forces beyond laboratory definitions. The behavior reminded them of bioluminescence, but with none of the biological agents present, as if the river itself had awakened. While the storm over Jerusalem had displayed violent intensity, and the sanctuary light phenomenon had revealed quiet precision, the Jordan River's change expressed something else entirely: motion. It was not destructive like hail, nor architectural like the chamber, nor sentient like the creature observed in the Mediterranean. It was rhythmic, pulsing, beckoning, as though carrying a message downstream toward the Dead Sea. a place symbolically associated with endings, or perhaps carrying a message upstream toward Galilee, a place symbolically associated with beginnings. Some commentators saw it as a sign of purification, water preparing the land for something approaching. Others interpreted it as a warning, the river acting as a boundary marker between what was and what is coming. A few believed it was a signal that the land itself had entered a new phase of prophetic history, one in which every element of creation would participate. If the land was shaking, and the sea was stirring, and the heavens were opening, then water, ancient, restless, and emblematic, would not remain silent. The Jordan River had joined the pattern, and the pattern was accelerating. Continue watching the next part, because what happens in the skies above the Mount of Olives will deepen the mystery even further. Its sunsets paint the stone hills gold, and its winter clouds often gather in solemn, brooding layers. But in the days following the extraordinary events across the city and the wilderness, the heavens above Jerusalem began to behave in ways no generation had ever witnessed. It did not begin with thunder or lightning. It began with shape. One afternoon, several shopkeepers in the old city noticed a cluster of clouds forming with unusual sharpness, far more defined than typical cumulus masses. As the winds shifted, the shapes elongated, curving into wings so precise that people stopped in the streets to stare. What looked at first like chance soon grew unmistakable. An enormous cloud formation resembling an angel stretched across the sky, wings extended, head bowed as if in flight or vigil. As the sun lowered, the figure sharpened instead of fading. Shadows carved along its edges gave the impression of feathers layered one over another. Pilgrims wept openly. Children pointed upward, whispering. Even those who doubted every story emerging from Jerusalem that week could not deny the clarity of the form hovering overhead. But the skies were not finished. Later that evening, new clouds gathered behind the angelic silhouette, darker, heavier. As they shifted, an outline appeared that left the crowd breathless. A cross, angled slightly, and what looked like the faint shape of a body suspended upon it. The figure was not detailed, yet the posture, arms outstretched, head lowered, evoked the crucifixion with haunting clarity. The clouds did not merely resemble symbols, they formed images charged with meaning. Word spread instantly. Residents poured into courtyards and onto rooftops. Visitors staying near the Damascus Gate rushed outside. Some saw only shapes. Others swore the imagery was so vivid that it bordered on vision. Phones recorded fragments, though no camera could match the contrast the human eye perceived in those moments. Then came the sounds. At first they were faint, distant vibrations, too melodic to be thunder, yet too resonant to be wind. Witnesses described them as tones, long and metallic, rising and falling like the breath of a horn. Others said it reminded them of a shofar, though deeper and more mournful. A few compared it to a trumpet, echoing across vast stone corridors. What startled observers was the rhythm. The tones repeated in structured intervals, as if answering some pattern beyond human hearing. Dogs barked, birds scattered. People held their breath, waiting. Scientists stationed across Jerusalem scrambled for explanations. Atmospheric acoustics, wind interacting with narrow corridors, temperature inversions refracting distant industrial noise. Yet none of these theories accounted for the correlation between the shapes in the sky and the timing of the trumpet-like tones. Meteorologists, already stretched thin by the storm anomalies, documented the formations as hyper-defined stratocumulus, sculpting under unknown conditions, a phrase that explained nothing. They could not explain why the images persisted longer than cloud structures naturally should, nor why they maintained their proportions even as winds shifted. Theologians, meanwhile, interpreted the skies with far more urgency. In biblical literature, clouds are not passive scenery. They are instruments of revelation. God speaks through them. Angels appear within them. Trumpet blasts precede divine intervention. Some scholars pointed to prophetic writings describing signs in the heavens as part of a larger sequence of events that would accompany spiritual awakening or divine confrontation. Historians added another layer. Jerusalem is filled with traditions in which the sky serves as a canvas for messages. From ancient deliverance narratives to apocalyptic texts, the heavens above the city have long been described as communicators, but never in living memory had shapes so explicit appeared above it. As days passed, the phenomenon repeated with variations. Sometimes only wings formed, sometimes only the cruciform figure. Sometimes both emerged simultaneously, illuminated from behind as if lit by an unseen source. And on 2 separate nights, residents from opposite ends of the city reported hearing the trumpet-like tones at the exact same moment. Long, rising blasts, followed by abrupt silence. Psychologists argued that people in times of distress often project symbols onto random shapes. Yet that explanation faltered in the face of consistency. Hundreds of witnesses, from different neighborhoods and backgrounds, describing the same details independently. Whatever the cause, the skies above Jerusalem had joined the escalating pattern. The storm had shaken the land. The chamber had opened the earth. The sea had raised its hidden creature. The sanctuary had revealed an angelic presence. Now the heavens, ancient, symbolic, and impossible to control, were speaking in form and sound. They offered no words, but their message was unmistakable. Something above was watching, signaling, and aligning. A warning written in clouds. A summons carried on the wind. Then the pillars appeared. A single vertical column of cloud rose from behind the olive groves, narrow and perfectly straight, like a sculpted beam stretching from the hillside into the sky. It did not drift with the breeze or widen like typical cloud formations. It held its shape with unnatural precision, a pale tower suspended in place. Within minutes, a second column formed beside it, followed by a third, each identical in height and form, spaced evenly as if placed with intention. For observers on the ground, the sight was disorienting. Clouds do not behave like architecture. They do not align themselves like sentinels standing watch. Yet that morning, the sky above the Mount of Olives resembled a row of ancient pillars rising from an invisible foundation. Meteorologists rushed to the scene, expecting to classify the structures as updraft columns or rare atmospheric vortices. But the usual indicators were absent. The air showed no vertical turbulence, no temperature inversion, no moisture gradient capable of creating such shapes. Instruments recorded an unusual lack of wind. Not a calm, but an absence, as if the air had been temporarily anchored. Then, something even stranger occurred. Light began to move inside the pillars. Soft bands of illumination pulsed within the cloud columns, rising and falling as though traveling through a hollow space. The brightness did not scatter or diffuse. It stayed confined inside the vertical forms, glowing in rhythmic waves that reminded some witnesses of lantern light flickering inside tall glass cylinders. Photographs captured the phenomenon clearly, and videos showed the pulses moving upward in silent succession. As the pillars continued to stand, a faint hum resonated across the hillside. Not mechanical, not electrical, but harmonic. Some described it as the sound of distant singing. Others compared it to the hum of wind moving through an old stone well. Whatever it was, it carried no identifiable source, and yet the vibration seemed to align with the movement of the light. Religious scholars recognized the symbolism instantly. The Mount of Olives is more than just a ridge of trees. It is a stage for prophecy. It is the place where ancient processions entered Jerusalem, where kings fled and returned, where Jesus delivered final teachings, and where, according to some traditions, revelation will once again break upon the world. But the symbol that most resonated with the pillars was older, still rooted in the earliest accounts of divine guidance. In the Exodus narrative, the people of Israel were led through the wilderness by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. These pillars were not merely signs, they were manifestations of presence, direction, and intervention. To many witnessing the Mount of Olives phenomenon, the resemblance was undeniable. What troubled atmospheric scientists was the duration. Cloud structures of this nature should dissipate within seconds, yet these pillars held for more than 30 minutes, even when breezes resumed across the hillside. The formations did not distort or drift. They dissolved only after the pulsing light within them faded, disappearing in a slow unraveling that left no trace of vapor behind. International experts reviewed the footage. Some insisted the pillars were a rare meteorological convergence. Others proposed unknown atmospheric optics. Yet none could replicate the shapes or explain the internal luminescence. A few attempted to classify the structures as standing lenticular formations. But colleagues dismissed the claim lenticular clouds do not form vertically, nor do they glow. Among theological circles, discussion took a different tone. Many viewed the pillars as a continuation of the pattern emerging across Israel. A storm without precedent, a chamber, long sealed, breaking open, the sea stirring with hidden life, a sanctuary revealing a rift in light, and a river beginning to glow. Now the sky itself had joined the sequence. If the land, the waters, and the shadows beneath the earth were responding, it seemed fitting that the heavens, often described as the realm where signs first appear, would participate as well. Yet, there was another layer to the symbolism. The pillars did not appear above the Temple Mount, the Western Wall, or the Old City. They appeared above the Mount of Olives, a place strongly associated with return, with transitions, with the meeting point between what has been and what is yet to come. It is a ridge that watches Jerusalem without belonging fully to it, a threshold of sorts. As the light faded and the pillars dissolved, witnesses remained on the hillside long after the sky cleared. Many described a sense of being addressed, not spoken to, but summoned to attention. Nothing about the pillars offered destruction. Everything about them offered warning. The sky had formed its own message, written in cloud and light, visible to anyone who lifted their eyes. If you want to follow the unfolding of every sign appearing across this land, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. More revelations are coming. In the days following the storm, the chamber's unveiling, the sea encounter, the sanctuary light, the glowing river, and the pillars above the Mount of Olives, Jerusalem entered a period of quiet observation. Not because the city grew still, but because everything, every stone, every street, every breath of wind seemed to carry a different quality. Residents described it as stepping into a familiar home, only to realize the furniture had been moved while they were away. Nothing was overtly altered, yet everything felt touched. The first signs emerged in the old city. Cleanup crews working near the shattered rooftops noticed that the air held an unusual clarity. Dust, which typically lingered for days after construction or damage, dissipated with surprising speed. The narrow passageways of the Christian quarter smelled cleaner than usual, absent of the heavy mixture of stone, dampness, and centuries-old residue. Workers paused at times, remarking that the air seemed lighter, though none could explain why. In the Jewish quarter, elderly residents who often struggled with the dry, irritative atmosphere of the region found their breathing unexpectedly easier. Several commented that the air reminded them of early spring mornings from childhood, the kind that felt more like blessing than weather. It was not a scent, nor a temperature shift, but a refinement in the way air moved across the skin. But the most distinct change occurred in the botanical life of the city. Following the storm, the ancient olive trees had appeared devastated, splintered, stripped, cracked in ways that seemed irreparable. Many had assumed they would spend years in recovery, if they survived at all. Yet, less than a week later, bright green shoots began emerging from the broken limbs. Some trees pushed out new leaves in clusters so vibrant they looked almost unreal against the scarred bark. Gardeners accustomed to slow, patient growth were stunned. One said, "These trees are acting as if they received a command." Similar reports came from Gethsemane, where trees older than empires bore fresh budding along wounds that should have remained dormant for months. Botanists hesitated to declare the growth unnatural, yet privately they admitted they had never recorded such a rapid regenerative response in ancient olive wood. The pattern was consistent. The deeper the break, the brighter the new growth. Elsewhere in the city, small details accumulated. Streets that had been littered with debris became unexpectedly clear after a single sweep of wind that seemed almost purposeful. Areas notorious for stagnation alleys that rarely received direct sunlight felt purified, as though the storm's aftermath included an unseen cleansing. Residents noticed that the nightly fog, which normally settled over certain valleys, receded earlier than expected. Stranger still were the subtle electrical anomalies. Phone batteries drained more slowly. Radios picked up brief, crisp frequencies at dawn, then fell silent. Lamps glowed marginally brighter at the same wattage. Engineers recorded a faint improvement in electromagnetic stability across several districts, though no infrastructure upgrades had been made. It was as if a veil of interference had been temporarily lifted. Some argued these details were coincidences, psychological projections onto a city still tense from shock. But others noted that the changes were too broad, too consistent, too deeply rooted in the sensory fabric of Jerusalem to dismiss as imagination. Something in the aftermath was rearranging not the structures of the city, but its condition. Religious leaders, already attuned to the mounting sequence of signs, interpreted the changes as a direct counterpart to the storm. The hail had struck like judgment, sharp, sudden, violent, but the aftermath felt like renewal, echoing themes woven through prophetic writings. The purifying fire followed by restoration, the scattering followed by regathering, the tearing down followed by rebuilding. The imagery aligned closely with Ezekiel's description of cleansing water and a renewed heart. It mirrored Isaiah's promise that the desert would blossom after reckoning. Even the olive trees, their broken frames sprouting unexpected life, echoed the ancient symbol of Israel's endurance. Battered, but not extinguished. Wounded, yet awakening. Scientists, by contrast, struggled to categorize the changes. The rapid botanical regrowth contradicted drought season expectations. Air quality shifts did not align with seasonal patterns, and the electromagnetic improvements were too mild to classify, yet too consistent to ignore. As one researcher stated, "If this were a natural correction, it's the most coordinated one I've ever seen." The people of Jerusalem sensed the same coordination, not in fear, but in awareness. The storm had left scars, but the city did not feel broken. It felt as though something had passed through it, something that first shook, then refined. No voice had spoken, yet a message lingered in the air, carried by the wind, reflected in the new leaves, embedded in the quiet hum of the recovering streets. It was not a warning like the earlier signs. It was preparation, as if Jerusalem itself was being readied for what would unfold next. International news networks ran constant coverage, stitching together every available image and eyewitness account, from the hailstorm to the pillars above the Mount of Olives. Commentators struggled to decide whether these events were scientific anomalies, prophetic signs, or a convergence of both. Yet no matter the angle, the tone was the same. The world was unsettled. Governments reacted first. Israel's allies issued statements of support, expressing concern for the damages and promising aid. But behind closed doors, intelligence agencies demanded classified briefings. The question dominating those meetings was not political, it was existential. Nations wanted to know whether the storm was a natural disaster or something else entirely. Leaked reports suggested that several countries questioned whether the atmospheric disturbance over Jerusalem could represent a new form of environmental warfare or an unknown atmospheric threat. Those theories dissolved once the other signs began surfacing. No military device creates regenerative olive trees. No secret weapon opens ancient chambers with pinpoint fractures. No foreign technology produces glowing rivers that defy hydrodynamics or cloud pillars that stand motionless for half an hour. The world realized this was not the work of nations. It was something larger, something that did not fit into any geopolitical category. Religious communities mobilized next. Major Christian networks held emergency live streams, discussing the alignment of events with passages from Matthew, Luke, Daniel, and Revelation. Jewish commentators revisited prophetic texts, long treated as allegory. Islamic scholars pointed to descriptions in classical writings about times when the land of Jerusalem would bear signs in the heavens and signs in the earth beneath. Even Hindu and Buddhist commentators began drawing parallels, cycles of cosmic upheaval. In every tradition, one theme emerged. Jerusalem does not experience anomalies in isolation. When Jerusalem trembles, the world watches for meaning. Scientists attempted to temper speculation by focusing on data. Atmospheric physicists published preliminary models suggesting rare thermal inversions. Marine experts proposed deep-sea disturbances. Archaeologists urged caution regarding interpretations of the chamber. Yet their voices struggled for traction. The public had already seen too much. The footage circulating across social platforms of the glowing Jordan, the creature rising from the Mediterranean, the sanctuary light splitting like a veil, defied the boundaries of conventional explanation. The global conversation shifted from "what happened?" to "why now?" In Europe, political analysts debated whether the Middle East was entering a period of spiritual reawakening or destabilization. In Asia, sociologists studied the psychological impact of prophetic imagery resurfacing in modern context. American commentators speculated that these events could trigger a cultural shift toward religion or toward fear. Meanwhile, the stock market experienced brief fluctuations each time new footage emerged. Investors reacted less to financial data and more to collective unease. Markets often behave like barometers of human emotion, and during those days, the needle leaned toward uncertainty. National security agencies worldwide began sharing reports about unusual public behavior. Increased prayer gatherings, sudden spikes in religious discussions, widespread dreams and visions reported on social media, and a surge in people searching for explanations beyond the material world. Sociologists described it as a global atmospheric shift in consciousness. A polite term for a world trying to interpret signs it had no vocabulary for. Academics held emergency symposiums, though much of their discussion slipped quickly from scientific hypothesis to philosophical questioning. If the storm over Jerusalem was not isolated, and the subsequent signs were not random, what pattern was emerging? What sequence were these phenomena forming? Perhaps most striking was the reaction from nations historically indifferent to spiritual matters. Leaders in several secular countries, normally dismissive of anything resembling prophecy, requested private analyses from religious scholars, not because they believed, but because they could not ignore the uncanny timing of events spanning land, sea, sky, and ancient structures. Jerusalem, a city already layered with history, expectation, and sacred meaning, had once again become the axis of global attention. News anchors spoke with hushed voices, analysts used phrases like unprecedented, unexplainable, and concerning for all nations. Even entertainment media shifted tone, realizing that these events carried gravity beyond spectacle. A pattern had formed, one too synchronized, too multi-layered, too symbolically loaded to dismiss. And though governments outwardly maintained calm, their private assessments reached the same quiet conclusion. Jerusalem was no longer experiencing events, it was signaling them, and the next sign, whatever shape it takes, may be the one no nation is prepared for. Stay with us as we examine what this means in the larger prophetic framework. Long before modern nations existed, long before seismographs and satellites attempted to decode the language of nature, ancient scripture described a system of patterns, an ordered sequence through which divine messages were revealed. These patterns were not isolated symbols, but clusters, groupings of events that only gained meaning when viewed together. Prophets did not merely observe individual signs, they studied convergence, and it was convergence, not chaos, that defined the days now unfolding across Jerusalem. The idea is simple, yet deeply structured. A single anomaly may be coincidence. Two may provoke curiosity. But when many realms react at once, land, sky, sea, and sanctuary, Scripture describes it as the threshold of revelation. This framework begins in the earliest prophetic writings. Isaiah, Joel, Ezekiel, and later Jesus himself spoke in layered sequences, weaving earth-level events into patterns that informed each other. These were not random disasters tied together by imagination. They were signatures predictable in structure, unpredictable in timing, and they always appeared during periods when the spiritual climate of a nation approached a decisive point. Jerusalem, in particular, occupies a unique place in this prophetic architecture. More than a geographic location, it is the symbolic center of alignment. In the Scriptures, when Jerusalem experiences simultaneous disturbances across multiple domains, it signals that a divine narrative is in motion. Not a conclusion necessarily, but an escalation. What distinguishes the present moment is the breadth of the signs themselves. They do not follow a single category. They originate from different layers of creation. A violent atmospheric event shatters the land. A sealed chamber opens beneath the earth. A being emerges from the sea. A rift of light appears in a sacred space. A river glows with movements beyond chemistry. The sky forms pillars that defy meteorology. In prophetic literature, these categories are not separate, they are relational. The prophets described creation as a unified testimony, each element capable of bearing witness. When the land trembles, the sea often responds. When the heavens open, the earth reveals what had been hidden. The pattern described by the ancients resembles a chain reaction, not of physics, but of meaning. Matthew 24, for example, presents signs in a cascading sequence: disturbances in the heavens, upheaval among nations, natural anomalies, and revelations within sacred spaces, not individually, but together. Luke 21 expands on this by describing signs in the sun, moon, and stars, then upon the earth distress, and finally, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. In other words, a multi-layered disturbance is the hallmark of transition. Jewish prophecy offers a similar structure. Isaiah speaks of a moment when the foundations of the earth tremble, then immediately pairs it with imagery of light, revealing hidden things. Ezekiel blends visions of water transformation with heavenly openings. Joel describes land upheaval, cosmic signals, and spiritual outpouring in a single breath. These frameworks were not metaphors scattered randomly, they were templates. Ancient interpreters used them to discern whether events were isolated occurrences or parts of a coordinated sequence. Under these frameworks, Jerusalem's recent phenomena do not appear fragmented. They align in a pattern recognizable to those who have studied prophetic cycles. The storm represents the shaking of the land. The chamber represents the unveiling of what was sealed. The sea creature reflects disturbances in the depths. The sanctuary light signals a thinning of the boundary between realms. The glowing river echoes transformation in the waters. The pillars of cloud fulfill imagery related to guidance and visitation. A modern observer might categorize these as unrelated anomalies, but in prophetic analysis, they represent a single narrative unfolding through different media. Like instruments in an orchestra, each plays a different tone, yet together they form a unified composition. One of the most intriguing aspects of this pattern is timing. None of the events occurred months apart. They emerged within the same season, as if synchronized by an unseen clock. Timing is crucial in biblical prophecy. A sign given in isolation may carry meaning for individuals, but clustered signs, especially those occurring across multiple realms, speak to nations. They are national messages, not personal ones. Another defining factor is escalation. Biblical signs do not begin with the most dramatic manifestation. They build. A storm precedes an unveiling. An unveiling precedes a stirring from the deep. A stirring from the deep precedes a revelation in the sacred space. The sequence moves from the external to the internal, from the visible to the interpretive, from disturbance to disclosure. Jerusalem appears to be moving along that sequence now. What remains uncertain is the destination. Prophetic cycles rarely conclude without transformation, political, spiritual, or existential. And while interpretation must be cautious, the convergence happening across Jerusalem echoes too closely the frameworks described by ancient prophets to ignore. The signs are not merely happening, they are aligning. And alignment, in biblical terms, is the moment before unveiling. For generations, Jerusalem has been a city whose atmosphere carries more weight than stone, and history alone can explain. Its tensions, political, spiritual, and cultural, rarely remain confined to human conflict. Instead, they often seem interwoven with threads of something older, something described long before the modern world existed. Today, as unease settles across the city once more, many are noticing a familiar pattern. The emotional and spiritual climate of Jerusalem aligns eerily with the rhythm of biblical prophecy. The scriptures portray Jerusalem not merely as a geographic place, but as a spiritual barometer. When its tension rises, the pulse of prophecy quickens. When unrest thickens, certain passages seem to lift off the page and step into the present. What makes the current moment so striking is not any specific event, but the overarching tone saturating the city. It is a tension that feels purposeful, layered, and strangely anticipatory. Ancient writings often describe seasons in which Jerusalem becomes the focal point of unseen struggle, where heaviness settles over its hills before decisive shifts occur. Prophets spoke of days when conversations would grow hushed, when leaders would meet behind closed doors, when the ordinary rhythm of life would feel disrupted by an intangible pressure. Such warnings were never vague. They were markers that something beneath the surface was preparing to break forth. Many scholars argue that Jerusalem is once again entering such a season. The atmosphere itself feels sharpened. Community leaders describe a rise in restlessness, a sense that people are waiting for something they cannot name. Merchants in the old city report that even the ebb and flow of crowds feels unpredictable, as though daily routines have lost their natural pace. Local clergy note that worship gatherings have grown more intense, not from external crisis, but from an internal stirring. People are praying with urgency, questioning with sincerity, listening more intently than before. Scripture often describes such periods as hinges, moments when time seems to lean forward, preparing to swing into a new chapter. These hinges do not always coincide with visible upheaval. Sometimes they precede it, sometimes They are the quiet before revelation. The prophets warned that there would be seasons when the tension itself was the sign. Jerusalem's current climate reflects this precisely. There is no single explanation, no isolated catalyst. Instead, it is the accumulation of countless subtle shifts, conversations that carry unusual gravity, debates growing sharper, voices calling for moral clarity, and a widespread feeling that the spiritual atmosphere is tightening. These are the conditions biblical authors associated with the approach of significant turning points. Scholars who study prophetic patterns note that Scripture rarely emphasizes sudden endings. Instead, it emphasizes build-up, the steady alignment of circumstance, emotion, and expectation. A nation begins to feel watched. Its leaders sense the need for wisdom beyond their own. Its people grow aware of their vulnerability and their purpose. These internal transformations often precede external revelation. Jerusalem seems to embody this sequence once again. What stands out is how the tension crosses all boundaries. It is felt among the devout and the secular, the young and the elderly, the local and the foreign observer. There is a shared perception that the city is poised on the edge of something, that its destiny, long intertwined with prophetic literature, is preparing to unfold in ways not yet visible, but increasingly undeniable. The prophets described Jerusalem as the place where earthly and divine narratives intersect, a city where moments of heightened tension signal more than socio-political change. They signal spiritual transition. And when the patterns of Scripture align with the pulse of the present, the wise pay attention. Today, Jerusalem feels like a prophecy waiting for its next line. Its tension is not simply tension, it is alignment. If the ancient pattern holds true, the city is approaching a moment when meaning will break through mystery, and the unseen will step into view. For centuries, scholars, skeptics, and believers alike have debated how the final chapter of history would begin. Some predicted political collapse, others imagined cosmic upheaval. Yet ancient Scripture consistently outlined something far more intricate, a moment when the familiar borders of creation would soften, when the natural and supernatural would overlap, and when signs would appear not sporadically, but in rapid, undeniable succession. Jerusalem, long described as the center of the nations, would stand at the crossroads of that convergence. Now, the world is witnessing exactly such a moment. What makes these developments so striking is not only their unusual nature, but their coherence. The signs emerging across the land form a continuous thread, not purely destructive, not purely hopeful, but transitional. When biblical prophecy speaks of the nearness of the end, it rarely emphasizes a single, catastrophic event. Instead, it describes alignment history arranging itself like pieces of a long-awaited design, tension building like the final breath before a decisive proclamation. In that light, the true question is not whether Jerusalem's recent phenomena can be explained. The deeper, unavoidable question is whether humanity dares to ignore them. Prophecy does not require complete understanding. It requires awareness. The final era described in Scripture is not marked solely by calamity, but by awakening eyes widening, hearts stirring, nations trembling without fully understanding why. It is a moment when humanity is confronted not just with danger, but with purpose. Perhaps the most profound feature of this hour is the global rise of expectation. Across nations, cultures, and even belief systems, people are sensing the same acceleration, the same unease, signaling that history is no longer moving at its usual pace. There is a shared intuition that the world is approaching a threshold, a point beyond which ordinary explanations fall silent. If the ancient texts are accurate, and if these signs are part of the ordered sequence they describe, then the purpose of this alignment is not terror, it is invitation. Scripture depicts the return of Christ not merely as the closing of an age, but as a revelation, the unveiling of what has been hidden since the beginning. It is portrayed as the moment when wrongs are confronted, truth is exposed, nations are weighed, and human hearts are illuminated with a light that cannot be resisted. The signs leading toward that moment are never subtle. They are designed to awaken the complacent, steady the faithful, and call the uncertain to attention.